Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello. Before we begin, I just want to give a quick reminder that all of you have entered the call today in listen-only mode. You will have the opportunity throughout the webinar to type in your questions for us, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible following the presentation. However, if we are unable to get to your question, we will follow up with you after the presentation concludes. Also, just as a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available 24 to 36 hours following the conclusion of the session. With that out of the way, my name is Cami McElhenney, and I'm NACOLE's Director of Training and Education. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us for today's session, where Liana Perez, our Director of Operations, and I will be discussing what civilian oversight is, the different models, its guiding principles, the benefits of implementation, and more. Liana and I have the pleasure of getting to speak to people around the country who are already working in an oversight agency or are living in a city where they are trying to implement oversight. A common factor is that they all have questions about the basics. To get this information out to as many people as possible, we have decided to run this training module once a month for the foreseeable future. Whether we have 5 or 500 people in attendance, I truly believe it will be well worth it to get this information out to as many people as possible. Community members, law enforcement, government officials, elected officials, students, journalists, and more. We also house a copy of the training, the recording of the training on our website, so you can also find it there. Although Liana and I do have quite a bit to share with you this evening, I do feel like we are just scratching the surface. Therefore, I want to let you know that we do have more in-depth training available beyond this. We produce webinars throughout the year, and recordings of those webinars can be found on the NACOLE website. We also host an annual conference, which happens to be going on now. If you are interested in learning more about the sessions offered and register for some or all of the 32 webinars that make up this year's virtual conference, that information can also be found on the NACOLE website. I will post links to those resources and more in the chat box during the webinar. With that, Liana and I will take a moment to introduce ourselves before we begin. Liana?
Good afternoon and good evening to some of you. I'm talking to you today from Tucson, Arizona. I am, as Cami said, the Director of Operations for NACOLE. I've held that position since 2014. Prior to that, I was the police auditor for the city of Tucson from 1997 up until the time I retired in 2014. And as Cami mentioned, we are basically the two staff members for NACOLE who have the pleasure of answering the phone calls and talking to groups that are organizing themselves to bring oversight to their communities. We do a lot of additional training and kind of one-on-one types of resources for individual communities. So we are available to assist you as necessary. So we will give you a lot of information, but I'm sure with that will come a lot of questions for additional information as well.
And as I mentioned earlier, I'm Cami McElhenney. I've been the Director of Training and Education for NACOLE since 2015. However, my involvement with the organization started back in 1998. I'm actually talking to you from Indianapolis, Indiana today, where I started my work in civilian oversight as a board member for the Indianapolis Civilian Complaint Review Board. I served on that for 6 years and was introduced to NACOLE through there, spent many years volunteering, acting as a contractor for the organization, and now, as Liana mentioned, I'm 50% of the staff. So with introductions out of the way, let's get into the information so that we hopefully will have time for some of your questions today. So first I want to talk to you a little bit about civilian oversight of law enforcement and its principles and its role. I like to start every presentation with a little bit of information about really that gets to the heart of what you can expect from civilian oversight. As all of you know, there is a lot to be done to make the criminal justice system more just. And I think it's important to remember that civilian oversight alone is not sufficient to gain legitimacy. It's not going to fix all of the problems within the criminal justice system or with police. However, without it, it's difficult, if not impossible, for the police to maintain the public's trust and push sustainable reform efforts forward. So the rest of this presentation, I'd like you to all to keep that in the back of your mind. So let's start with some basic definitions of civilian oversight. Civilian oversight can be defined as the following. It can investigate audits or reviews of internal law enforcement investigations, policies, procedures, community complaints, and use of force incidents. It can also conduct ongoing monitoring or auditing of law enforcement agencies' policies, procedures, training, management, and supervision practices. But above all, it's really important to keep in mind that civilian oversight is a process that involves active participation by people who are not sworn law enforcement. Civilian oversight, we have the first, I guess, inklings of oversight way back in the 1920s with a review board that was established in Los Angeles that had no authority. It wasn't done through any kind of legislative action. It just existed. And of course, it wasn't really able to do anything. But even from that time forward, as civilian review boards were established and became more common throughout the country, it was seen as more of a reactive process. And still to this day, there will always be a reactive element to civilian oversight, particularly if it's looking at any particular incident or complaint. So it's often seen as reactive. Agencies created after a high-profile incident or scandal. I think that's very well demonstrated right now. Since the murder of George Floyd, we have been speaking to city after city, many counties and many state-level organizers looking to implement some kind of civilian oversight. But that has been happening on a local level throughout the country for years. Responding primarily to individual complaints, as I mentioned before. It reviews policies as a result of one or more complaints. It's not really going in and looking for trends. It emphasizes legalistic rules. It is often a process that can be seen as adversarial, particularly by law enforcement, and recommends sanctions for individual officers and relies as its greatest effort as deterrence to try and get officers to stop having incidents of misconduct, because there is an oversight agency that will investigate them and hopefully root out that misconduct. However, we are seeing more and more a process that is proactive. Oversight's taking on these proactive elements. It looks at problems proactively through investigation, collection of data, analysis, identifies underlying issues and causes. Rather than just looking at a specific incident of misconduct, it actually looks back at what might have caused that, what kind of changes in the organization can be made to help keep that type of thing from happening again. Concentrates on reduction and prevention of misconduct, builds partnerships with law enforcement, and very importantly, it's working more than ever to help create bridges between law enforcement and the greater community. So there's a couple things that everyone should probably know about the field. I don't think that there are too many people that know a lot of the details about civilian oversight, but might know a lot about the more overarching concepts. So currently, and this is, I would say this is post-June of this year, there are currently thought to be approximately 166 active civilian oversight entities across the United States. When I'm talking about active civilian oversight, I am not talking about advisory boards. I'm talking about oversight entities that exist through city charters, ordinances. So there's some legislative action that has put them into effect. They have authority and mandates. And the reason that we don't count the advisory boards in that number is because advisory boards often don't have any authority, that they really are there just in an advisory capacity and can be dissolved with the change of an administration, or some of those advisory boards are sometimes put into place by police chiefs or sheriffs, and you have a new sheriff, a new police chief, the advisory board may disappear. It's also important to remember that no two entities are exactly alike. Oversight is formed in communities in a way that takes into consideration the needs of the community And that's why all of them are a little different. Particularly early on, most large cities and large law enforcement agencies have oversight of some sort. There's only really one major city, I think in the top 15, that doesn't have civilian oversight. However, what we're seeing now is an incredible rate of growth, a number of small and mid-sized cities that have civilian oversight. And in fact, since June, Liana and I have talked to cities where they have agencies of 2,000 sworn law enforcement, and we've talked to cities who have 18 law enforcement. So there is a very wide range of cities and municipalities that are looking at oversight. And also, it's important to note that civilian oversight had been, there really haven't been any Department of Justice settlement agreements in recent years. However, previously, we did start to see civilian oversight being more prominently featured in Department of Justice settlement agreements, which is really important because I think people are understanding that once monitors leave a city, someone still needs to be there to oversee what's happening. So why is oversight necessary? And I have this slide in here, and every time I present it, I always think, well, I doubt that there's anyone listening to me right now that doesn't know why it's necessary. But I'll still go through it quickly. So it protects human rights. It promotes constitutional policing. It increases public confidence and trust in the police. It builds bridges. It supports effective policing. It ensures greater accountability, and it enhances risk management. And I think that one of the reasons I leave this in here, because if you're trying to explain to political actors, the powers that be in your community about why this is so important, this slide is a great jumping off point for that. We will also be sending out a copy of the slide deck to all of you, so please feel free to share this with anyone you might think it would be helpful for. We also have an infographic on our website under the resources tab. If you go to Civilian Oversight Basics, it is a great infographic on how the benefits of implementing civilian oversight in your community. And I would suggest that you also use that if needed to try to help explain to people why it is so important. So some of the common goals of oversight. One is that it ensures that the complaint process is accessible to all and that there are few, if any, barriers to the filing of complaints. For example, if you do not have civilian oversight, really one of the only ways to file a complaint is if you go in to a police station and file a complaint with some member of the law enforcement agency. Civilian oversight, more often than not, has their office outside of the law enforcement agency's department. Many of them have the ability to accept complaints online, and those who didn't before COVID definitely have moved in that direction. Many have the ability to accept complaints anonymously. So really, one of the goals is to make it as accessible as possible. And then also, once you have a complaint, one of the goals is to make sure that all of the investigations into that misconduct are fair and thorough, and that the findings are reasonable and the discipline is appropriate. Now, not all oversight agencies have the authority to impose discipline, but many have the ability to, particularly if they're an audit or monitor model, which Liana will get into in a little bit, have the ability to see how discipline is being imposed. It also works to improve confidence in the police and enhances the transparency of an organization that is traditionally very opaque. And it does that by publicly reporting on the department's efforts and holding officers accountable. And when we get into the principles, I'll talk a little bit more how it reports on things like that. Additional goals, it improves the policies, practices, training, and management of law enforcement. It deters officers from engaging in misconduct through the creation of more effective and consistent investigation and disciplinary processes. Reduces legal liability associated with officer misconduct, and improves the public's understanding of police policy, training, and practices. Now, I will say that these common goals, one of the things to remember is that those goals are achieved when we have effective oversight that is implemented in a way that takes into takes into consideration the necessary authorities to allow oversight to fulfill those mandates or goals. You know, if an oversight entity is set up and it has absolutely no power to do anything, then chances are it won't really be able to do anything. But we have worked really hard and to come up with some principles for effective oversight and also effective practices of civilian oversight. We're not really going to get into the effective practices. We'd need you for probably a couple more hours so that we could really dive into those. But soon that information, we do have a report on the state of the field and effective practices in civilian oversight that we are hoping will be available for public consumption either by the end of this month or the beginning of October. And that will dive very deeply into the effective practices of civilian oversight. And because you've signed up for this, we will make sure that when that is available, that everyone receives notification that it's now available to access. So next I'm going to get into the 13 principles for effective civilian oversight. So the 13 principles reflect information gathered from pre-existing works by several scholars and oversight practitioners, such as Sam Walker, Barbara Detard, Catherine Olson, Joseph DeAngelis, Richard Rosenthal, and others. So not all of these aren't brand new principles. Some of them are new to this list, but we have collected some of the work of the best minds out there who have been writing on civilian oversight to come up with a more comprehensive list. So together, the 13 principles form the preconditions for effective civilian oversight. However, building that type of oversight really requires balancing and prioritizing the principles based on what the community stakeholders determine to be the most important for the community that the law enforcement agency or the civilian oversight agency serves. So first, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but I do want to touch on all of them. So first, we have independence. So one of the most important defining concepts of civilian oversight is independence. It refers to an absence of real or perceived influence from law enforcement, political actors, other special interests looking to affect the operations of the civilian oversight agency. An agency must be able to maintain but also demonstrate the extent of its independence even in the face of high-profile events. Next, we have clearly defined and adequate jurisdiction and authority. So in other words, who does the agency oversee and how can it operate? While expectations of an agency can vary widely, having adequate jurisdiction and authority are crucial in achieving organizational goals and ensuring that the oversight agency can be responsive to the community. The level of authority an agency has in relation to its core functions must permit the agency to successfully perform its duties to the greatest extent possible. Next, we have unfettered access to records and facilities. So an oversight agency it's incredibly necessary for them to have the ability to review all records relevant to an investigation or other matters within the scope of civilian oversight agency's authority, and should be able to do so in a timely manner. That's maybe one of the most important parts of that sentence, is the timely manner. So timely access is essential because it provides effective, informed, and fact-driven oversight. Similarly, those agencies performing oversight of jails and prisons must have unfettered access to facilities and the staff in order to do their job. Next, we have access to law enforcement executives and internal affairs staff. So the effectiveness of an agency can depend on its ability to effectively communicate with law enforcement officials regarding matters of concern identified throughout the course of their work. So legislation establishing civilian oversight should absolutely require that the law enforcement agency provide timely, written, and public responses detailing why they accepted or rejected any particular recommendation. It's also important to remember that sustained dialogue promotes cooperation. I'm sure Leanna and I can think of several instances where that inability to have sustained dialogue, whether it was adversarial or very easy, Unable to have that dialogue has led to disastrous consequences for an agency. So next we have full cooperation. So in addition to the access to relevant records and executives that I already mentioned, effective oversight requires that the full cooperation of all officers and department staff throughout the course of its work. This type of cooperation is necessary to conduct thorough investigations, obtain sufficient information to perform the mandated work of the agency. Next, we have sustained stakeholder support. An otherwise well-designed oversight mechanism can be undermined over time by a lack of meaningful support from those who can contribute to an agency's success. For some, supporting civilian oversight may be politically expedient in times of crisis. And I think that we are seeing that right now. Everybody has jumped on to say, oh yes, we are more than supportive of civilian oversight. The problem is what happens after it's established and everything has quieted a little bit. How supportive are they then? So that's when we really need to worry about the sustained stakeholder support. So successful oversight requires the sustained support and interest of stakeholders who value independence, accountability, and transparency. An agency's ability to maintain support may be a function of outreach to those stakeholders, maintaining productive relationships, even when disagreement or conflict is unavoidable. A great example of this is the New Orleans Office of the Independent Police Monitor. They are excellent at continuing and working the stakeholder relationships in their community and building those relationships in a way that when they come under fire or something serious is happening in the community has their back. And so that is incredibly important. And I say community, but it's not just community members, it's the broader community. All of those actors, all of those stakeholders that fall under that broader community umbrella. So next we have adequate funding and resources. So political stakeholders have to ensure that their support for civilian oversight is not just words. It has to include sustained commitment to provide adequate and necessary resources. This includes money for adequate staffing, training, outreach, report publishing, all of that. The easiest way to starve an agency is by taking away its funding. And that often has happened to agencies. And I think we're all a little concerned about it right this moment because of the budget cuts that are coming in cities from the after effects of the COVID pandemic. So next, we have public reporting and transparency. So civilian oversight provides a unique opportunity for the public to learn about misconduct complaints and other areas of law enforcement agency that serves the community. At a minimum, an agency should issue one report to the public each year. Regular reports are crucial, by the way. They need to happen. If they're supposed to happen every year, they happen once a year. If they're supposed to be twice a year, they should happen twice a year so people know they're coming. Next, they should be written in a manner that makes the reader able to understand the agency's authority, purpose, procedures, and accomplishments. It is your window. It's actually the world's window into you so that they can actually see what you are doing. But it should also include patterns and trends in complaints or discipline, recommendations, outreach activities. And actually, let me go back to recommendations. Not only should it report on the recommendations that you've made, it should also include the responses from the law enforcement agency to those recommendations. And it also should include any issues that might be of concern to the public. Agency, if able, should also provide special reports on specific matters, such as mass protest response, use of force reporting, and they should also do follow-up reports if they've made any recommendations. A great example of that is the Office of the Inspector General for the New York Police Department does special reports often on things that they have analyzed data for. And they did a report on use of force reporting and made many recommendations to improve that process. And then, as a follow-up, they did another report on it several years later to see, A, if those implemented practices or recommendations if they were implemented, and if so, how were they doing? Were they making things better? Next, we have policy and pattern analysis. So this kind of analysis has a great potential to advance the goals of effective oversight by addressing systemic problems of law enforcement agencies and formulating recommendations that will improve relations with communities. When recommendations are made, the law enforcement agency, as I've mentioned before, must provide timely written responses to the oversight agency's recommendations, and they should be required and they should be made public. Next, I'm going to consolidate community outreach and community input. So outreach allows for an oversight agency to build awareness of its existence, solicit community input and involvement, facilitate learning, build relationships, share reports and findings, build coalitions, and develop a greater capacity for problem solving. Community and stakeholder input regarding how civilian oversight should and is functioning, and which accountability issues it should address, will result in the creation of a best fit oversight system that can meet the needs of the community. So in other words, there's the out and the in. You need to get your message out, but you also need to be listening to the community as well. Next, we have confidentiality, anonymity, and protection from retaliation. So civilian oversight must, and I cannot emphasize this enough, function with the same integrity, professionalism, and ethical standards it expects from and promotes for law enforcement. It needs to protect sensitive information as well as those who disclose it. It must respect confidentiality agreements, maintain the anonymity of those who wish to share information anonymously, and it must create an environment where people who contact the agency can do so without fear of retaliation. And lastly, we have procedural justice and legitimacy. So these should serve as core principles guiding the work and processes of effective civilian oversight. Procedural justice typically centers on how authority is exercised. For those entities established by law, the recognition of their right to that authority and perceptions of how fairly that authority is exercised are crucial components of legitimacy. So it's important to note that procedurally just interactions between law enforcement and the community positively impact the public's compliance with laws and willingness to assist in crime control efforts. There's been a lot of studies showing that. But it's also important to consider that a procedurally just complaint process where complainants report being satisfied with the quality of communications and the process itself increase complaint satisfaction and trust in the process. So next, I know that I said that we wouldn't get into effective practices, but I did want to talk a little bit because one of the things that we hear from a lot of people that we talk to is what are the best practices? We need a list of best practices and all of the research that shows those best practices. But the problem is that using the term best practices has some limitations. So social and political contexts make it really difficult to identify successful practices employed by one jurisdiction and transfer them to another. So, and that a lot of that comes from the simple fact that no two civilian oversight entities are exactly the same. So because of that, the goals don't always lend themselves to systematic comparative measurement. There's a lack of standardized definitions, which we're working on, but currently there are a lack of standardized definitions relating to the data being collected. Law enforcement agencies don't all collect the data exactly the same. And then analyzing that to make cross-jurisdictional comparisons is almost impossible. And as I mentioned before, no two civilian oversight agencies are the same. So that's what we're left with when someone asks about, well, what are the best practices? So instead, we've moved to an effective practices framework. So it's important to remember that there are several paths to success when we're talking about civilian oversight of law enforcement. As Liana is going to talk about later, there's several different models that we work from, and just because you've chosen one model over another doesn't mean that you're any less successful in your practice of civilian oversight of law enforcement. In developing effective practices, you must allow for flexibility and context, but take into consideration that which is understood to be crucial to successful and effective oversight. Oversight needs to take into consideration core values and principles that should be satisfied to produce better outcomes. And you need to take into account all of the diverse perspectives and wisdom of those practitioners that have been doing this and have learned some valuable lessons along the way. And also, stakeholder input and dialogue needs to be prioritized. Those who this is affecting need to be consistently listened to find out what is working best. So when we make recommendations for effective practices, and when all of you have that moment to dive into that report where we talk about specific effective practices and how those might fit in your community, you need to actually think about what is an appropriate fit for our local context. How will this effective practice strengthen oversight in relation to the 13 principles that I just went over? And what are the potential unintended consequences of implementing this practice? All of those things need to be taken into consideration. So with that, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Liana to talk a little bit about the models of oversight and their ranges of authority.
Okay. Can you hear me? I was going to unmute myself, but you did it for me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So before we get into the different models, I do want to reemphasize that all of these models, really, if you keep in mind the 13 principles that Cami just went over as part of, your incorporating them into, ordinances or charters or what you really want to see the oversight entity doing, or the authority that you want to give the oversight entity, keeping in mind those 13 principles is very helpful as you work on the language to structure these entities. Also, something I wanted to mention, as Cami said, we've gotten so many calls and talked to people from all over the country. And even though we're going to talk about 4 basic models, what we're really seeing especially in the last couple of weeks, I will say, is taking the hybrid model to a whole new level, if you will. There are community task forces being structured all over the country with a very broad and diverse group of community members coming to the table with great ideas on what the needs of their community are and what they want to see with the oversight model in their community. We've also heard from a lot of communities that actually have had models in place for a long time and are going kind of back to the drawing board, so to speak, and saying, what are we missing? The needs of our community have changed in the past, 15, 20 years since our model was put into place, and we want it to be either more robust or have more community involvement. So we're looking at all these different models and what effective practices again are happening in other parts of the country. So there's a lot of activity right now in creating and recreating some of the models out there. So this is just kind of a little reiterating what Cami said. Many of the calls that I get, especially in the last several weeks, are, we need oversight and we need it like yesterday. How quickly can we put something in place? And my recommendations are, if you do it based on those reactive models, you may not be as successful because you may be totally missing the ball with respect to what it is you think the community needs versus what they really need. And so, it's really more of a process, a process involving all the stakeholders that will be affected. Really, I can honestly say that anything that takes less than, 3 months is probably, I don't know, maybe, but probably not as well thought out as maybe a process that takes, a couple more months. I'm not saying a year or years, but usually, 6 months seems to be kind of the magic number with respect to having appropriate, amount of time, community engagement, bringing all the stakeholders to the table and doing the appropriate research to see what models may be more effective in your community. So it takes time, planning, and definitely a collaborative and transparent effort. I was on a call yesterday afternoon with a group that we've been working with for a couple of months. Unfortunately, COVID stifled it a little bit, but that group has continued to meet virtually, and they're doing all their virtual meetings in public, which has almost actually turned out to be something that is more transparent for that community, because originally that task force was meeting, on a monthly basis, in a meeting room, and now they can do their meetings virtually and have those deliberations and discussions about, what they're considering for their model, and have their whole community being able to get on those discussions. So we're going to talk about the common models that we most often refer to, and these are also talked about very specifically and in detail in the report that Cami mentioned that we're about to release. We're going to talk about the review focus model, the monitoring / auditing focus model, and the investigative model, and then, as I said earlier, the hybrid model, which seems to be very popular these days. So talk about the review focus model first. Usually this is a model that's kind of commonly known as mostly like your actual review boards. These are the model that ensures that the community has the ability to provide input into the process. It's usually the boards, almost all the time, are boards that meet in the public environment, have public meetings, so you can create that level of trust and transparency with the community, because the community is actually seeing what you're doing as a board. These are usually individual boards or commissions that are authorized to review completed investigations and can either agree or disagree. And when I say review completed investigations, basically they are reviewing the work of the law enforcement agencies, internal affairs divisions that are, internal affairs is usually investigating the complaints. They create the investigative package, and then the actual review model, which is usually a community board, reviews what's contained in that investigative package, but they're doing those reviews for the most part in the public eye, in public meetings. They're usually staffed by, they're usually volunteers, so they're usually not paid staff, so they're usually volunteer community members. It gives that additional look, if you will, from the community's perspective or eyes into the process. Sometimes they do, depending on how it is written into their enabling, legislation or, city charters or ordinance, they may oftentimes have the ability to send something back for further investigation if they feel that it was not a thorough or fair investigation. And sometimes they can agree and disagree with the findings. So the model oftentimes also has the ability to accept complaints to forward to the law enforcement agency, as Cami mentioned in one of her bullet points too, as far as that ability to, file your complaint someplace other than the police department is, in some communities, that's a very real fear for individuals wanting to file a complaint. So many of the actually review focused models have that ability to accept the complaints themselves. Oftentimes there's professional staff kind of linked to the board. In other words, they are there to assist the board with, the actual documents and everything in the file. They can provide also feedback to the law enforcement agency if they're seeing things, perhaps patterns or trends in the files that they're reviewing. Here again, remand the cases back for further investigation. Sometimes they can recommend case disposition. In other words, do the facts, support a disposition of, a finding of sustained, not sustained, whatever the categories may be for that particular agency. Sometimes they can have the authority to also recommend discipline. I believe Oakland, under their new structure, has that ability, and that was given to them by voter mandate several years ago. Oftentimes they can hear appeals from complainants and even subject officers. So if a complainant is not satisfied with the outcome of their complaint, they can file a request to the actual board and have their complaint reviewed. Many times they hold public forums, particularly for, high-profile incidents or issues at the community or tensions within the community, between the community and the law enforcement agency. We're seeing a lot of that happening right now, especially with, the protests, the increased number of protests in communities that have never experienced this before. A lot of the oversight entities are actually holding public forums about, how the law enforcement agency is reacting and interacting with protesters in these various communities. The outreach under this model is usually conducted either by the staff that's assigned to the board or even the board members themselves. Mentioned I was the auditor in the city of Tucson, but we also had a board, and the board members themselves would actually do a lot of the community outreach to stakeholders in the community that they were either affiliated with or not, with respect to doing outreach in schools and at public events or libraries, different advocacy groups within the community. It's very important to have that component regardless of the outreach component, regardless of the model that you're working under. And basically they're holding their meetings in accordance with state laws and union contracts. And when I say state laws, Cammie said the reason that there's not any two agencies that are alike is because they're doing business. Basically, they're operating in different states across the country that have different state laws with respect to public meetings and what can be disclosed. Sometimes there's union contracts that prohibit any discussions of specific, like naming officers by name or actually discipline that's imposed in a public forum. So they oftentimes have to adhere to those, sometimes those limitations are sometimes impediments to the level of transparency, but to the extent possible that they can disclose that in public meetings goes a long way to reinforce that level of transparency with the community. So the investigative focus model, this is kind of the one that used to be the one that was most wanted. I'm saying, or the level of interest is very high. This is often seen as the end-all be-all of the type of model that you want. However, there are some limitations to it, and there are some challenges depending on depending on where what state you're either doing operating in, or sometimes the amount of resources that you have. So the pros, or the upside of these types of models, are that they can often reduce bias in the investigations, or even perceived bias, because basically the investigations are not being conducted by the law enforcement agency. It is a completely separate agency, not connected to the law enforcement agency, with its own set of investigative and supervisory staff that are conducting the investigations. So they hire full-time investigators that have training as investigators to conduct these investigations. They don't rely on the investigators from the law enforcement agency, but oftentimes they do need to obtain a lot of the information, such as the body-worn camera videos, and police reports and radio transmission reports and everything from the law enforcement agency. Yet they are compiling that information and using it as part of their own investigation. So this model in itself is really one that really is perceived as, that the civilian-led investigations increase that level of trust in the process more so than any of the other models, because it's looked upon as being taken completely out of the hands of the law enforcement agency to conduct those investigations. This is a picture of NYPD's oversight agency, which is considered one of the largest in the country. So reiterating here a little bit, they employ the professionally trained staff to conduct the investigations. They work independently. they can oftentimes replace completely the critical functions of an internal affairs unit, because if all your complaints are being investigated by the outside agencies, oftentimes there's not a need for, or the volume of cases that are really being reviewed by the law enforcement agency itself. They often have investigative jurisdictions over certain types of allegations. And when I say that, sometimes, especially depending on the size of the city and your law enforcement agencies, sometimes they have to kind of either triage or prioritize the types of allegations that they will look at. Think of, your highest, more severe types of allegations, such as use of force, racial bias. Some of those types of allegations are often triaged just to be able to handle the volume. They have the ability to conduct interviews of the witnesses, including the law enforcement officers. They gather their own evidence and they prepare their own investigative reports, and then they can make the findings based on whether the evidence either supports the allegations or not. And in some cases, this model can also recommend and impose discipline. Again, going back to that depends on how it is structured with, the ordinance, or is it structured based on a city charter or legal mandate, or oftentimes if it's under a consent decree, it will determine the amount or the level of authority that this particular model can have with respect to imposing discipline. So the auditor focused model, this is kind of seen as a compromise between the board and a fully investigative, a review board and a fully investigative model, because in this particular model, you really have a little bit of the best of both worlds, so to speak, without a lot of the actual resources. I forgot to mention, under the investigative model, it is very resource intensive. In other words, to be able to have your own investigative staff and supervisory staff for that type of model can be cost prohibitive in some agencies or some communities, because it can be very expensive to sustain when you have your own investigators. Under the auditor monitor model, you can have the ability to review completed investigations and actually even monitor ongoing investigations without necessarily having to have your own investigative staff. It's often seen as a model that can have more robust reporting practices than other models, because many times they're given the authority to look at not just individual complaints, but systemic issues, and looking at the whole issue of law enforcement and interactions with your community in a holistic way, as far as being able to make recommendations for change based or training, or based on patterns or practices or trends that you're seeing in the complaints. So this goes along with being able to promote long-term systemic changes in these law enforcement agencies. This model tends to be less expensive than a fully investigative model, but a little more expensive than a review. For when we say expensive, it's all relative, right? Based on how you staff these models. Review focused models, as I mentioned, many of the times those boards are volunteer boards. Under this type of model, you really need to have professional staff. You need to have a full-time auditor or monitor, and usually, somebody, if you're going to look at patterns and trends, usually your staffing will include like a data analyst and intake specialist, because you'll also be able to intake complaints as well. So this model allows this agency, the agency, to engage in many or all the steps of the complaint process from start to finish. In other words, the intake, the reviewing of the complaint, the making the recommendations for either under the findings, or also making recommendations for changes to policy, training, et cetera, based on what you're seeing as a result of your reviews. So just to reiterate a little bit, they have the authority to audit, monitor, investigate, and review a wider range of the policies and practices and procedures because you're looking at the whole picture, not just individual complaints. So you're seeing where there's problems. You're seeing maybe where there's problems with impediments to even the complaint filing process itself. You can ensure that the complaint investigations comply with established policies and procedures. In other words, as you're reviewing those investigations, you're looking to see if the individuals involved complied with, appropriate training standards or, policies within the department. It can oftentimes have the ability to involve yourself. This is where kind of the monitor piece comes in, monitoring ongoing investigations by sitting in and observing the interviews of the witnesses or the officers and being able to ask your questions at that time, even though you're not, when I say you, that, as the monitor or the auditor, even though you're not conducting the investigation, the law enforcement agency is, but at least if you're monitoring an investigation, especially like maybe for a high profile incident, that you're being able to ask the questions that you believe need to be asked to ensure that that incident is looked at thoroughly. You can also monitor the disciplinary process to ensure that it's fair all the way around, so that it's consistent with and that the discipline meets the actual violation, so to speak, that officers are being disciplined consistently. In other words, not more harshly under one supervisor or one division or however you term that, but that also the complaints that are being substantiated, for, the fairness to the community with respect to, is one violation, does that warrant, a reprimand versus, a suspension? And so you're looking at all those in totality. You also have the ability, most auditors and monitor models have the ability to take the complaints, do the complaint intake, and classify the complaint. And I mentioned earlier that sometimes agencies, depending on the volume, will have to kind of either triage or categorize the type of complaints as far as the severity of the allegations. Oftentimes, the monitor, the auditor have the ability to be part of the complaint classification process as well. And then they can make recommendations regarding all aspects of the law enforcement agency, and most importantly, that community engagement piece. The auditors and monitors are very involved in community engagement. Many of them have actually an established, Cami referenced New Orleans. Denver also has a very robust outreach and community engagement process, as do many other cities across the country, because it's very important. I mentioned that there's some communities that are trying to, well, not trying, but in the process of kind of reevaluating what they have. And there's some communities that I've talked to that say we want oversight. And I'm like, you have oversight, you've had it for 20 years. And they're like, we don't even know it exists. So it's very important that once you establish it, you continue to do that community engagement, because the community needs to know that you exist and what your levels of authority are, and that you're out there basically sharing that information so that the community has that full awareness. And then there's the hybrid models. These are the models that really are taking parts from one or more of the various models. Here again, they are being done to develop, to look at the specific needs that the community is trying to address. They can oftentimes be as part of the process of modifying something that already exists. And these are, as I mentioned, these are increasingly common. I would encourage you to look at, just in the last 2 weeks, like I said, look at what Madison, Wisconsin just did last week. Actually, they adopted a auditor model with a board attached to it, but have incorporated a lot of the authorities that are normally given to an investigative model into the authority of the auditor and the board itself. So that is seen as one of the more, every year we're asked, or not every year, but often we're asked, what is the more robust model? And just when we think we've seen one, another one comes along, because they are using these hybrid models and creating and pulling the best that they feel best practices or effective practices that they feel will be more effective for their community. Like I said, Madison did one. Alexandria, Virginia is pushing a model through, more of an auditor model, but it's also a hybrid because there will be additional elements from that are taken from the other models as well. So there's a lot of exciting things happening out there right now with respect to the hybrid models. So some of the common functions of this model is they can review the completed investigations. They're looking at the oversight function from different vantage points rather of the different models. Sometimes there's multiple, as I mentioned, what Madison, Wisconsin just did. Sometimes some cities have multiple agencies performing very distinct functions. So Seattle, for example, has three different, kind of like a three-pronged approach to the oversight there. They have their kind of auditor-monitor model, but that is within the agency, the law enforcement agency itself, but it is basically overseen by a complete civilian staff. They have an inspector general that actually is kind of overseeing that a lot of the recommendations from one of their former consent decree is being implemented, and then they have a community board that is very engaged in, the outreach and, and speaking with the community and taking in, looking at issues on a larger level. So each one has their designated functions, if you will, in oversight over the same agency. Under this model as well, you're hiring basically professional staff who can receive the input and feedback from either the boards or commissions that are representing the community. And they can also evaluate the oversight entity or entities in place. So some of these models also are built to be the oversight for the model. So just as the oversight mechanism is the accountability for the law enforcement agency, the oversight model also has to be accountable to the community. So sometimes there's components of that built into these hybrid models as well, where a board is reviewing, the actions or the work of like an auditor or a monitor, so that there's community input into that process as to the effectiveness of the work that part of the model is performing. And I think, so one of the things to consider, and we kind of leave you with these thoughts, and I know we're going to have some time for some questions too, but one of the things that, or a couple of bullet points here that we would suggest that you ponder as you're moving forward, as far as, what are the challenges that the new or improved agency have to address right now. And, we've seen examples of that, day after day in cities across the community, especially with all the conversation about use of force. And then, of course, that's led to, protests and how protests are being monitored and law enforcement's interaction with protesters. So what are the things that need to be addressed right now? What challenges will there be in the near term, or will they be ongoing? I would, I've been doing this for a long time. I would say that some of the challenges that we're seeing right now are going to be ongoing in the future, because I think that a lot of these things are going to continue to evolve, but many of the same components as far as the transparency, the accountability, and the responsiveness to the community are all going to be the expectations that the agency is going to have to address for all time, continuously. And what opportunities exist for the agency to advance its mission and provide oversight, effective oversight. And there's a lot of ways to do that. I think most communities are in a lot of them are in a different place in their process. But I would say that right now, given the climate and the added attention to oversight in general, regardless of the model, it's almost like, unfortunately, but maybe not so unfortunately, it's kind of like the perfect storm for these agencies to get established with the support of the community stakeholders that need to support these agencies and have them appropriately resourced and sustainable for the long term. So that is, an opportunity I think that a lot of community groups are seeing right now, and really moving with that and actually moving forward with things that they've been trying to get in place for many, many years. And this is their opportunity right now, and they're getting a lot of community support and at various levels to see those things happen and really come to be. So go ahead.
Well, thank you, Liana. And I want to apologize to our audience. Someday, Liana and I will be able to condense that even further, but there's just so much information that we want to make sure that you have. And as I said before, we're just touching the tip of the iceberg as far as the information we'd like to provide to you. So for those of you who are still on and can stay with us for a few minutes, we'd like to take on some of the questions that have been posed during the session today. So the first one is, as we work to strengthen our oversight office, we are challenged by opponents and some supporters to prove that the oversight office is worth the expense by providing examples of tragedies that would have been avoided or lawsuits averted if we had effective oversight of our much sued law enforcement agency. So there's a three-part question. Are there any studies that prove that effective civilian oversight reduces use of force or lawsuit payouts using data as opposed to anecdotal evidence? So I can tell you, I'm going to just do one at a time here. I can tell you that there are currently academics working on studies to try and look at civilian oversight and have that data that people want. They want proof. There really aren't any right now. Most of it is anecdotal, unfortunately. I can tell you that and as far as lawsuits and payouts, there are academics like Mark Iris at Northwestern University who's done a lot of looking at the payouts for law enforcement misconduct, but hasn't done that piece that shows once oversight is implemented, does that number go down? So we have been talking to a lot of academics, and I do believe, and Liana may have talked to some of them specifically, that this is introducing a new era of research in oversight and criminal justice reform in general and its effects that it can have. So Liana, do you have anything to add to that?
No, other than the challenge all along has been obviously that nobody's really, other than Mark, has taken up this research to date, because we are asked for this information often. One of the challenges has been sometimes the ability to get the data about the payout of lawsuits, because oftentimes it is, sealed settlement agreements that we basically don't have access to be able to make those, even look at the data, be able to begin to make comparisons. So yes, we are working with anecdotal data right now.
Well, and then the next two parts of that, is it even possible to do such a study? And if you could, how would you answer the calls for proof? So I think it does go to that, what we talked about earlier also about best versus effective practices, that really the things that make it difficult to even determine what best practices are apply to this as well. I mean, it really is, the definitions across jurisdictions are different. The data that's being collected is different. So we need to work on some standardization, which is something that we are, that is kind of in the hopper for us to work on standards for oversight, so that we can try to address some of that, so that we can work on doing those cross-jurisdictional comparisons. The next question we have is, I'm glad we answered that question first, because there are a lot of questions regarding how we can show that proof. The next one is, what effect do police unions have on effective operation of the Civilian Oversight Board? Liana, do you want to take that?
Sure. So that is actually one of the questions we're asked very often. There's especially when you're establishing a new agency, we recommend that the unions are part of the stakeholder group when you're working on that process, because the resistance is usually coming from the unknown, not knowing how the oversight agency is going to affect them with respect to the disciplinary process. And as I mentioned earlier, cases being discussed, publicly, and officers' names being used publicly. So we are always recommending that the police unions be one of the essential stakeholders when these conversations are happening, so that they know what is being recommended and how it will be affecting them. Now, having said that, we do know that agencies sometimes, often, especially many times, the agencies that have subpoena authority, when they use that authority to subpoena an officer's testimony, oftentimes they will be met with those challenges by the union with respect to requiring them to appear for to give statements. So here again, based on what state you're operating in some states, the union contracts have a lot more strength than in others, and you almost have to kind of work around some of the things to be able to, when I say some of the things, some of those impediments to be able to get to what your bottom line really is, which is, thoroughly being able to investigate a complaint. So yes, there's pushback, but and many times it can avoid it if they are brought to the table early on.
Thanks, Leanna. So the next question goes back to when I mentioned the one major city in the top 15 that didn't have oversight. Well, I was referring at the moment to Phoenix, they're close.
Very close.
They're very close. But there are some other, and actually, Phoenix is in the top 5, I think, actually. There are some other cities who have, like San Antonio has a form of civilian oversight. They're working on strengthening that. But most of the other ones have some form. But I will say many in the top 15 are actually reevaluating what oversight they do have right now. So thanks for that question. The next question is, it's just wondering why subpoena power is not noted. So subpoena power is listed in our effective practices recommendations. Subpoena power is tricky. There are some civilian oversight entities who have it, who then spent many years, Newark is an example, they spent many years not being able to function because they were in the midst of a lawsuit that kept them from exercising any of their authorities, even though the lawsuit was mainly geared towards their subpoena power. So there are quite a few organizations or agencies out there who don't have subpoena power, who have been able to work around it and work through MOUs or just sheer cooperation with law enforcement to be able to get what they need to do the work that they've been mandated to do. And sometimes what the agency has to provide is spelled out within the ordinance that enables the agency itself, which is incredibly helpful. Now, having subpoena power is great. Being tied up in lawsuits for years is not great, but if you can get it so that you can have it in your back pocket if you need it, it's great. But there are always challenges I guess literally there are challenges to that, but there are also some agencies out there that have subpoenas for power for years and they've never been challenged by a union or the agency itself on it. So the next question is, how dangerous is it to serve on a civilian oversight board? What insurance coverage is available to board members? So I think Leanna and I both can answer this. So when I served on a board for 6 years, I I didn't feel unsafe at all. We did training. I did ride-alongs. I think the only time I might have ever felt unsafe were on specific calls at 2 o'clock in the morning, where I wondered if it was really a good idea that I was on the call. But I never felt unsafe. There has never, I do not know of any civilian oversight board member, and granted, I'm not all knowing, that has had any retaliation against them by law enforcement for doing or volunteering to do the work. So in that regards, I think that it's fairly safe. And I can only speak from my experience. There was no insurance coverage offered to me. I signed a waiver before I got into the car for the ride along. So
well, you're talking about physical safety. There's also that oftentimes what's brought up the fear of, personal liability with respect to if you're making findings or recommendations and so forth. So oftentimes if you're sitting on a board, you're an extension of like that city government, so to speak. So your recommendations and so forth are, covered as you're not necessarily a public employee where the city would cover you, but they may have some extension of protection because they're operating under, being an extension of city government, so to speak, as a board member. When I'm saying, for lawsuits with respect to any kind of actions or what have you that you would make as a board member.
So the next question is, do you know of any oversight board examining the actions of police department public information officers? Liana, do you want to take that?
I'm not sure I understand. Well, so as far as the action of what they report or it appears that they don't report, I'm not aware of anyone. They would still fall under, any type of the complaint process. You could, file a complaint. It's really the actions or inactions of that particular employee of the department. I'm not aware of anything that's specifically towards CIOs, but not to say that it can't happen, that it's not happening or hasn't happened.
Yeah, I would assume that they fall under, as a sworn member of the law enforcement,
exactly,
that they follow the same, they're still subjected to the same agency guidelines for complaints. It would be my assumption.
I would suspect if they give a misleading story or misleading information or, information that may be inflammatory or what have you, those things would all fall under, the ability to file a complaint against them for their actions.
The next question is, so can this all work if an agency is imposed on law enforcement, and is it usually the case that the agency is imposed? So unfortunately, yes, a lot of times it's imposed. I will say that there's more proactive work to establish. Cities are not waiting for a critical incident that creates outrage, public outrage. They're now looking proactively at implementing it, so maybe they can do something before the next incident happens, and so that it maybe doesn't happen in their city. So that is happening. And I think one of the conversations we had recently with the city is that the percentage of cops who are doing their job, they're following the general orders, they're working well with the community, is higher than those who are not. And so there is that mentality where even if it is not an adversarial process, they still feel like something is being imposed on them for something they didn't do. And so I think it goes back to that stakeholder engagement and building relationships. That doesn't mean, I'm not talking about being co-opted, because that word does come up quite a bit in our conversations. I'm talking about building a relationship so that everybody understands that effective civilian oversight has a benefit to both community and law enforcement. And that's what you're there for. So, and then there is another question from this individual about what are the qualifications of the staff necessary to be able to investigate and determine outcome of complaints.
When you say, yeah, the staff of an investigative model is what I'm assuming the question is. Usually the the investigators are either they come from sometime you don't get a degree, I guess, in investigations, but they usually come from maybe an agency or something that has either investigated. I tend to lean towards sometimes like civil rights investigators or fraud investigators, just kind of that type of analytical background is very helpful, because you're also looking at all of the data or all of the evidence that you're collecting, and analyzing it to be able to make a finding or a recommendation based on the data that you're gathering. So analytical skills are very important. In this report that we're going to be releasing, we do talk about the various different positions within agencies and kind of what the recommended qualifications and backgrounds are for the different levels of positions within the oversight agency.
Thank you. So our next question is, and we'll try to take a few more before we have to end here. But what is the process for getting a civilian oversight board started? So I have a very long answer for that, but what I will say, in the sake of time, is that on our website we do have a guidebook for the implementation or enhancement of civilian oversight of law enforcement. And we actually did it several years ago as a project for an NGO that was working in Mexico. But it is very applicable to any city looking, or any city in any country looking to establish oversight. And it gives the steps and considerations. And so what I would suggest is looking at that document and then contacting us with any follow-up questions you might have. The next question is let's see, I think that we've answered some of these. Okay. And I apologize, there are a lot of questions here and I'm trying to find one that we have not already answered. There are several questions about mediation. And so there are some excellent examples of mediation programs out there, and there are some that are very different. Washington, D.C. Office of Police Complaints has a great mediation program. New Orleans has a great mediation program. San Francisco, Denver, and by great, I mean that they have really worked to make them an effective way of dealing with complaints that are not, they very much segment what is available, what kind of complaints are available for mediation. And within that segment, they have really been able to work wonders. And it's really nice in cities like Washington, D.C., they have been able to continue the mediation program even through COVID, so that they can continue that building and healing process. So,
so can I add to that just
yeah,
real quick?
Absolutely.
So when Cammy's, the term segment means more so, what is appropriate for mediation. So use of force and those types of excessive force types of complaints are not appropriate for mediation. It's usually kind of the, the attitude and rudeness types of complaints where, and mediation programs really also serve to do that bridge building with the law enforcement agency, that are, if they're resistant to the role of the oversight entity, because this is also giving them an opportunity to build those bridges with the community and vice versa. So those that do have these mediation programs are very successful with, that community engagement piece.
Thank you, Leanna. So the next question is, and I apologize, I'm still
That's okay.
looking for, oh, you mentioned you would do one-on-one to help a community. What does this entail? Leanna, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so usually if you reach out to me either by phone or through our info or the email that's down there, what we will do is, we can talk you through, where you're at, where you're at in the process in your community. Sometimes you're barely starting out, and sometimes the recommendations are that one of the first things that you want to also do is have the backing or get an elected official in your community to hear you out with respect to what it is you're proposing. It doesn't have to be a fully formed plan, but that they are supportive of looking into how this could work for your community. So it's usually, community advocacy groups that are contacting us from their communities, and we go through the different models. Sometimes we do training more. I mean, the training we did right now, sometimes we can do like a whole 8 hours of breaking down a lot more information on there. So if you have a community group that's working on this, or even just individually, we'd be happy to talk to you and give you some suggestions on next steps based on the size of your community and how your elected officials are, the structure of the government entity in your community, and possible approaches to get this moving forward.
Thank you. So the next is, do board members receive any kind of remuneration for service? So there are oversight entities who do provide a stipend for board members. And actually, we do recommend it as an effective practice only because you want to make sure that you have board members who are of the community, and not everybody is able to take time. Time is money, and being a board member, to really put the time in to review the cases, to attend the meetings, it seems appropriate to provide a stipend for that time and work that's being put in. I will say very few boards that I know of actually do it, and I do hope that trend changes. So I think we have now gone about 20 minutes over our time. And I know there are so many more questions here. And so Liana and I, we will be able to save those questions, and we will get back to you with answers if we're able, or at least some kind of comment. We'll at least let you know if we don't know the answer in the near future. So with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I know, and thank you for all of those who hung in with us till the very end. And we look forward to talking to you in the future and seeing you at other NACOLE events like this. So thank you, and have a great evening.
Thank you.